Well, welcome back to part 8 of Ancient Mesopotamia, Portrait of a Dead Civilization. We are summarizing the work of A. Leo Oppenheim. Today we're going to be talking about the great organizations, the palace and the temple. So we'll first look at what they share in common, briefly look at their distinctiveness, and then finally the role of the king who was over these two organizations. So what is it that they share in common? Well, both receive similar income. So income comes from agricultural holdings, be they farmland that was worked directly by temple or palace personnel, or those that were rented out and their renters were responsible for payment. Be they Income could also be derived from workshops that were run by the temple or palace organizations, making different types of products. Donations from worshipers and tribute from allies in order to keep Mesopotamian kings appeased, or from subjugated lands, tribute that was levied against them. That income in both places was redistributed to the palace or temple organizations in order to maintain their rations. Staff could be supplemented by prisoners of war and or indentured servants and their families. And both were considered to be households, a household of the god and a household of the king. But they are distinct entities. So because the temple is the household of the god, there is a distinction between that and the king. Both, however, required the servants of each, of both the palace and the temple, to care for the god and the king in similar fashion. So responsible for feeding and clothing and caring for. This was done at both the palace and the temple, but they were considered distinct entities in that sense. Furthermore, and this is probably the more important thing that Oppenheim points out, and that is that the temple operates based on the largesse of the king. So a more powerful and successful king resulted in a grander temple. This is true, of course, not only in Mesopotamia, but also in the wider Near East. So we see this, for example, with Solomon in the Old Testament. Given his great success, the temple was built and it was very extravagant. This is common to the Near East. When your king is successful and he has money to spend, he will spend it on the god, and often spend it on the god. And so the temple would become more ornate, and operations would be more extravagant. Temple rebuilding and care is a subject common to the royal inscriptions. So you see this when you look back through the royal inscriptions, and maybe you can ask Megan about this, as this is her specialization. And looking at these inscriptions and the subjects that they deal with, temple rebuilding and care is very important to the Mesopotamian kings. So speaking of Mesopotamian kingship, Oppenheim goes into a little bit about what kingship is in some detail. Kings were in charge. They were over both palace and temple. Even though the god was the owner and the rightful head of the temple and, of course, of the entire city, the king was placed in charge of his house. Kingship was therefore divine in origin, and you can see this in documents very clearly, for example, like the Sumerian king list. So the Sumerian king list says that kingship descended from heaven and was placed in this city with this king and this king and this king, and then it was taken from that city and taken over to this other city. So the gods were directly involved and responsible for the transfer of kingship, and it was divinely determined. Now, in the third and second millennia, kings often used what's known as the divine determinative. So you see the ding ear sign before the king's name. You see this starting in the Sargonic period and coming down through at least the Old Babylonian period. Kings assumed, in a very real sense, this divine status for themselves. Kings possessed their own melamu, and this is a type of terrifying aura that overwhelms the enemy of the person or deity that possesses it. Gods have melamu, kings can have melamu, but it is only present as long as their kingship is ordained by the gods. Now, there were some distinctions between the Assyrian king and the Babylonian king, so Assyria in the north, Babylonia in the south. The Assyrian king was considered to be the priest of Ashur, who was the Assyrian king was considered to be the priest of Ashur, and because of that, he performed specific cultic functions. He had a very prominent role in these cultic functions. He was given the tribal nature of northern kingship. He was probably considered, Oppenheim argues, a primus inter pares, or like the first among equals. He was surrounded by diviners and physicians because he was to be protected against disease or demonic influence. The Babylonian king, however, did not play this specific role as a priest. The priest of Marduk, for example, he was only allowed to enter the temple once a year, and it was under very specific regulation. The priest would strip him of his insignia, for example, during the Akitu festival. There's a video about that in our daily data. And so, there was distinction between how the Assyrian king was seen in relation to the god and how the Babylonian king was seen. However, Mesopotamian kings were ultimately responsible for the care of their people. So they were responsible for legal protection, for correcting abuses in the society, and ensuring the general welfare of the people. And in this sense, we cannot consider kings to be despots or dictators. They were genuinely, according to the text and according to what we understand from their actions, they were to care for the society. And of course, this was not a completely selfless act. Keeping people free of debt and free of poverty was good all around for the society, which ultimately was good for the king. And so, these were good for all parties involved. So, in summation, many similarities existed between the palace and the temple organizations. The temple was considered to be the household of the god, while the palace was the household of the king, and the care and feeding of the heads of both of these, or the primaries in both of these organizations, was the responsibility of those that worked for these organizations. The temple was dependent upon the success and largesse of the king. So as the king was more successful, so did the temple grow in its extravagance. Kingship was divine in origin, and there were differences between the roles of the Assyrian and Babylonian kings. And the primary difference that Oppenheim cites is that the Assyrian king took on a much more priestly role given his significant or predominant role in the temple in Assyria, whereas the Babylonian king was not responsible for these types of priestly roles and cultic functions. Kings, however, were responsible for the welfare of the people, and they worked very hard to ensure that the people maintained a life free from, as much as possible, kings were ultimately responsible for the welfare of their people. So that gives you a brief introduction to the great organizations, the palace and the temple. Tomorrow we're going to begin to look at the Mesopotamian city and how it functioned during this period of antiquity. So stay with us. Until next time, resist poor scholarship. Always ask, how do you know that?